what have you been working on? What is your school thinking? What have you been trying over the last couple of weeks, or maybe even beyond? Maybe you're already started doing this work. Anything you're sort of wondering about? We're digging into the how with this session, and Jesse will be joining us in just a few minutes, and he's going to want to hear about, like how it's going on the ground. So we want to hear the same thing. How is it going on the ground? What are you trying? What's working? What's not? Any of those conversations. Anyone willing to share? Lindsay.
So I tried something with my physics class that I'm not really sure where to go from here or what to do about it. Like, again, the temptation to grade it somehow is really strong. So what I did was I gave them a pretty hard worksheet, and what I did was I told them it was due on a Monday. Then on the Monday, a lot of them were not done or didn't really get it, and I got panicked emails all weekend. And I told them, like, on Monday, I'm going to give you the answers with no explanations. You can now talk to each other as much as you want to see if you can figure out why those answers are correct. And then you're going to resubmit. So I had them take pictures of their original work, and then I had them resubmit with new pictures. And then the next day, well, it was ideally the next day. A lot of people didn't even submit it, which was frustrating. But the next day I gave them the full solutions. And then what I wanted them to do was write me a reflection about the learning process. What did they kind of learn at each stage? And then I didn't finish fully reading all of them, but I got quite a variety of, like, some of my great, like really great students that are doing very well knew what I wanted. Like, they wrote like topic by topic. This is what I learned, and this is what I improved on. This is what I thought it was, and this is the change. And then some people just wrote me really vague stuff like, oh, I just learned a lot from this process. Like, they didn't really tell me a lot. And I was kind of going to write back to them asking for more. But I don't really know, like, the problem is we're kind of moving on into a new unit. So, like, do I keep revisiting this? Do I hammer down more feedback from them? And then at the end of the day, I haven't graded anything, which I guess is the point, but they were asking me what if it's marked and all this stuff. So I didn't really know how to answer them about it.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like that is like totally like the first iteration of a microshift. You did it, you got some reflection back, and now if you do it again, or when you do it again, what might you change to, my first reaction might be like the scaffolding of what that reflection looks like. So, some of them might be natural at like writing back, thoughtful reflection, and none of those need sort of guiding along that journey. So, but yeah, that's. Anyone else have any reflection or response to Lindsay or? Devin.
So at LC, we were trying to kind of implement like peer feedback school wide, and encouraging students to give each other feedback along the way. I can say in math, it's been really helpful for the projects they're working on to see like the knowledge mobilization around the room, and having students kind of give each other feedback in addition to myself. And so the learning is happening a bit faster. I will say though that towards ungrading, it hasn't been the most, it hasn't had the most like fruition, right? It hasn't come to fruition in that sense, because at the end of the day, there's still like the piece where how do I take that peer feedback and turn it into a grade while not grading, you know what I mean? So that piece is still difficult. I will say though that I really enjoyed like early in the year working on interviews. And I was talking to Rachel about this earlier this week, but really that felt way more in line with ungrading. Authentic conversations with students and talking about the learning, that was really, really great. I think the difficulty now is that the timings in high school have shifted back, which is great overall, but in terms of having those authentic conversations, it's harder to find the time to do that. So that's kind of the next challenge that I'm hoping to work around.
Yeah, we've heard that same difficulty or frustration with interviews and scheduling them, and where do you find the time, and what are the other students doing? Just like all those like little logistics that are important because you're still running a class, and you have 30 kids in your class, and how are you going to get through all these interviews? So it'd be interesting to hear some possible strategies. Maybe we can collect some of those strategies and put them together to share back as some potential ideas as people are going through. And I see Jesse. Welcome, Jesse. Welcome back. We're just doing a little bit of a debrief on some of the micro shifts we did over the last couple of weeks. So feel free to weigh in or pop on. What have you?
Good to see you all.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So yeah, I think I agree with sort of what's been said here, and that the temptation to like put a grade on something, it's hard. I think Lindsay said that, like, it's hard not to do that. I think I'm having trouble like how to reconcile, like, you know, I was doing some process letters was the main thing I was doing, but I'm also kind of in math trying to have it be a bit more, you know, come show me what you're working on, and we'll like talk, and I can give feedback, and then you can go back and then come and see me. But then I guess I kind of struggle with like, I'm putting in my notes, sometimes I just do a check mark, but other times I'm like, how am I going to turn these check marks into a grade, I guess, in the end? So there's like almost a temptation to write at least like a range of like what I saw there, like, okay, you know, or is it like a 3-2-1, like, you know, they did it really well, and or it was, you know, meeting the expectations, or it didn't yet meet the expectations. I think that's a challenge. Like, am I not, I guess the thought that maybe I'm not doing it right if I'm just not giving them a grade, but then still writing a grade down, or writing something down that's an assessment level, right?
Right.
But then otherwise, like if I have a whole term of information, like how do I turn that into a grade in the end, I guess. Anyway, I don't know if I have an answer, I just a thought.
Yeah, it's working within the system where we're still programmed to give grades, so it feels so wrong. You're like, oh God, I've got to give a grade to this. And two, you know, how does the conversation go from, you know, as Greg's saying in the chat, like really great feedback and listening to the learning journey, and then where does that shift happen, and when does it need to happen, or how long can we delay it to be assigning a grade and whatnot. Yeah, Jesse.
I'm going to try my microphone again. How is that?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay, good. I was just thinking of this quote that Clarissa Sorensen Unruh said in a panel that I was just on with her. And I've said a version of this, but she said it so succinctly that I really appreciate it. She said, we're not trying to replace grades with something else like grades. And the thing that's interesting about that is that what I hear and what you were saying, Amy, is this sort of desire that whatever else we do, sort of at the end, we have to find some translation rate, some sort of currency rate of exchange between whatever it is that we did and then the grade system. And I think the point of what she was saying was not that any of us can just remove grades completely off of the table, but try and imagine that what we're doing that's good doesn't necessarily have to have a neat and tidy exchange rate with grades, and that it's all right if what we do ends up short-circuiting the system a little bit. So we can be doing this kind of assessment that we really value and doing grades along the side because we're required to, and they don't necessarily have to have an exchange rate, if you will. But I feel that it's weird, after doing this 21 years, I feel that same thing that you're describing. It's like at the end of the day, I'm like, but wait, aren't I supposed to? Wait, I still have to do the act of bubbling it in, and I feel that same kind of existential, like, I think I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Any others for reflections? How's it going? And now that Jesse's on, specific questions about the how, things that you're wondering. Jesse, if you wanted to take over this point, I think Lindsay's wanted to say something, and maybe you can manage the queue at this point.
Jesse, you weren't here while I described what I had tried to do, but I had asked students to write a reflection on a process of learning. And I got quite the variety of answers, a lot of which actually from my weaker students was very vague and didn't sound very reflective at all. It was very like, yeah, I learned stuff. And it was like no description of what they learned, or, you know, like there was nothing for some of the students that I could see. And I wanted to go back to them and ask them about like, well, I need more from you. Like, what was the specific topics? What was it that you had a misconception about? Like, what is it that you've now learned? But, you know, like the problem is at the same time, it's like we've now moved on to a different unit, and I'm talking about something we've like bypassed like a week ago. And then I don't know, like without any grade incentive to do it, I just not sure like the kids would go back and write me back to respond to all the questions I had about their reviews. And again, that temptation to like, I don't know what I'm supposed to put down as a mark, and I'm hoping, like, I don't know, like they wanted to know if it was marked, and I just kind of vaguely didn't answer their question. So
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing that I would say is that that self-reflection is hard work, and so students won't necessarily be good at it. It's an iterative practice, which means that we get better at it over time, and we only get better at it if we're asked to do it repeatedly. And there was a question suggested in the chat, which is ask guiding questions that kind of lead the students through the work. It's almost like, and it isn't a worksheet, it's more just about asking critical questions that help bring out better, more thoughtful answers. And over the years, I've had to sort of fine tune my questions. And it's not about getting my questions longer. It's about asking my questions even shorter and more succinctly, so that it sort of gives the students a space to inhabit. But I'll say, after doing this for 21 years, I still have students who struggle to get who struggle to do it with any substance at all. Because in some cases, it's the first time that they've ever been asked to do this. Like, and if you think about it, like, get out of your own head, get out of your own body, look at yourself and reflect on your own learning. When is it happening? How is it happening? Where is it happening? What does it look like? These are incredibly hard questions to answer. I mean, one of the things that's sometimes interesting is to ask questions that probe at just the physical manifestation of their learning, because that's something usually they can access a little bit better. What does it feel like when you're learning? What does it look like when you're learning? And just asking them to describe the physical features of it. Because sometimes those sort of complex, almost existential, meta level discussions of how much they're learning, I mean, ask myself that question. How much did you learn, Jesse, in that last meeting that you were in? Now write a paragraph about it. I would actually struggle to do that. So I guess the thing that I would say, give them the space to practice and give them the space to not get it right, and have that be okay for you when they don't get it right. And that's probably the hardest part, because you're like, I want this to work. The thing is, I think it's working sheerly by the fact that you're asking them to do it. And then they'll be better at it the next time and the next time. I think the other thing that I do mechanically, and since I didn't hear, I came in halfway through what you were talking about. So I'm not sure if you were doing this. One thing I do is I talk about, because I am required to give grades, and because the students are, in a sense, when they're grading themselves, it has a real impact. I have to transfer it to a form at the end of the semester, and it appears on a transcript. So grades are real, whether or not I describe them as, off the table as much as possible. They still happen to students. So one of the things I try and emphasize is that the self-reflection is the most important work that we do in the course. That education is as much about the content that you're learning as it is about your ability to reflect on your own learning and reflect on your own abilities, your own capacities, your own mastery, etc. And so that sort of pushes the grade for the course, or the grade for the unit, or the grade for the term on the self-reflection activities, in a sense saying, I am going to reward the work, or the grade is going to, in a sense, reward the work that is most important. So if you can't remove the grade, at least have the grade attached to the work that is the most difficult and the most important. So that has helped me in some cases, just to sort of reframe where the grade in the course is going to come from, that the grade is actually going to come from the self-reflection and self-assessment, and not the products that they make.
And so, I think, sorry, what was interesting about what I had done was they were so concerned about the product, whereas what I really wanted to hear from them was the learning process. Mm-hmm. But that at the end of the day, I didn't even ask them to hand in their final product after after looking at my solutions. I just wanted to know what they got out of, discussing with each other about answers, and then trying to see from the solutions whether they're judge their own work and see if they understood it or not. But I almost think even at this point now, like whether I should be now putting up samples of what some good reflections were, so for the future they can realize how much detail I wanted, I guess.
I, and I sort of have mixed feelings about that. The one danger is that if you put up self-reflection is so idiosyncratic. If you put up examples, students will almost immediately start to mimic the examples. And that can be good practice for them because sometimes mimicry is a useful way into the actual work. But I think then you would have to talk to them about that. Put up the examples and say a couple things. Say, mimicry is not the ideal thing to do here. This is just an example for you to find your way into your own way of talking about your learning. If you feel stuck, feel free to mimic as a way of practicing and getting out of your comfort zone. And so just have them realize that mimicry might be a good way to get them over the hump, but it isn't ultimately, they shouldn't be trying to copy what someone else had done, because then that's not actual self-reflection. I also heard you say something about rewards, that in a sense, like, how are they going to do it if it's not rewarded, if there's not points, if there's not a grade attached to it. And I tend to find that the best thing I can do with students is just bring out some of the data or bring out a really short piece about, I often use a piece by Alfie Cohen, just from his blog, a very short couple paragraphs that talk about rewards and incentives, and essentially talk about how poor grades actually are as an incentive. And so students might feel like they're a really good incentive, but when they actually see and think through some of the data, they realize, oh yeah, that is what happens for me. When I'm incentivized by a grade, I do the work, but I don't do it the same way as when I'm incentivized by intrinsic motivation. And so they can usually see that their intrinsically motivated work is better than their grade incentivized work. And then that helps explain why you're not going to incentivize the sort of the producing of a product with a grade. So let's feel free to open it up. Feel free to jump back in, Lindsay, but anyone else who has, I got to hear a little bit of your microshifts. If anyone has a real sticky problem that you didn't talk about in the last bit and want to bounce ideas off of me, I'm happy to do that. But I'm also happy to take questions about anything that's coming up for you. I have a couple things that I might have us look at, and I'll just kind of weave those into the conversation. But I really want this to come out of your experience and your practice. That's an interesting point about they often learn to reflect, from Franna. They often learn to reflect in language courses, but then don't transfer that knowledge to other classes. And I think the siloing of disciplines isn't particularly fruitful for students. And I wonder if there's ways that we can break that down by doing some of the work that might be more traditionally done in a language class in other classes as well. And then also having students in their language and literacy classes reflecting on what's happening in their other classes. So in a sense that we're helping each other all do this work together. And I know that to some degree, we're also feel siloed. We feel like our day is so full that we often don't know what's even happening in students' other classes. But I think that maybe the students, just with simple prompts, the students might be able to give us a lens into what connections they're seeing between their classes. Other thoughts or other questions that people have? Ian.
I'm struggling a bit because most of what I'm reading about ungrading is for college and university age people. 11-year-olds who I teach and 20-year-olds process things very differently. I'm wondering if you can recommend resources that would help me visualize it better in an elementary classroom.
Yes, I have a couple things. I am going to recommend. I'm going to find the link as I'm going. There's actually a really strong movement in K-12 around ungrading. And in some ways that work was being done more fruitfully in K-12 environments before it came to the university. It came to the university later, I would say, but the university folks wrote about it in very public ways. The thing that I found really useful, which is true a lot of the cases, and then didn't always give credit to the K-12 folks who inspired their work, I would say the work of Alfie Cohen is really great. He's mostly speaking to K-12 audiences. And so the book Punished by Rewards is a fantastic resource. And the entire book is just riveting. But the great thing about Alfie Cohen's website is that he has lots of little small blog posts about rubrics, you can almost just Google Alfie Cohen and almost any subject related to grading or ungrading and find a really short blog post that's not only useful for you, but is readable by students as well. So he's a huge resource for me. I would also say that some of these Facebook groups, and I was going to look for some of the Facebook groups and actually link to them. There's lots of robust conversation happening there among K-12 educators. The other book that I really love is John Holt's How Children Fail. And John Holt, for folks who don't know, he went on to be a big movement in sort of a big actor in the unschooling and the homeschooling movement. But prior to that, he worked in the he worked as a math educator in K-12, working with elementary level math education. And so there's a lot going on in his work. And what the fascinating thing is, I find I'm not an elementary teacher. I do run camps for elementary students at the game and toy store that I run, but I'm not a trained elementary educator, and I am also not a math educator. But there's so much wisdom in his book, and almost every bit ends up being relevant to me in my practice, because he's really good at, in that book, really good at just describing not the what of going on in his classroom, but really the why and what he's noticing happening for the students. And the other thing that reading some of these K-12 educators has taught me is how much better K-12 students are. People often say, well, my K-12 students have difficulty doing self-reflection, at least the kind of self-reflection that you're describing in your writing and your work that you do with college students. I would actually say that the K-12 students are better at doing the self-reflection. They just need different kinds of prompts, and they need different kinds of space to have that conversation. When I sit and have a conversation with students at camps at my game and toy store, and I just ask them, so what have we done here? The answers that I get back are fascinating and things I never would have expected. There's a way that they have of seeing inside of what they're doing that I think that is actually lost among university students to some extent. So some of the things that I'm describing are more formalized with my university students, in part because I have to break them of habits that not that K-12 has taught them, but that our entire culture and society has taught them. I would never blame that on K-12 teachers, the way some, I hear some college students do, talking about things like college readiness. But what I'd say our whole culture and society is structured around having people quantifying their learning as opposed to be able to reflect on it in a nuanced way. Does that help a little bit? And I'll see if I can find those Facebook groups. I'm guessing if I'm not a big Facebook, I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook. That's why they weren't right at the ready. But if you just Google, not Google, but go on Facebook and search ungrading, but I'll see if I can throw some links in. Other thoughts? Amy.
Yeah, so I guess my question is related, to Ian. So I'm grade 7 and 8, so a little bit older, but around the same age. And I guess it just got me thinking about, the parents as well. Like I teach in the gifted program. And again, I don't know if you can answer that. I know in college and university, hopefully you're not having to deal with parents' concerns around those things. But I'm just wondering about, getting the parents on board for this. I mean, obviously their child will still get a final mark, but I guess, or maybe even just like how to make it visible for them or for the students so that they can, because they want to know what's happening and what grade their kid is going to end up with.
To some degree, I think it's about figuring out and being empathetic to what it is the parents are actually wanting or what it is that they're asking for. I think sometimes they're asking for, in that conversation, they might be asking for grades, but and you've alluded to this at the end of your question, what they're really asking is for communication. They want us, and also I think that most parents want to be, but don't know how to be involved in their kids' learning. And I think that the idea that parents just want to see, send their kids off to school and then don't want to be actively involved in what's happening there, I think that that's a real problematic, trope. But I think the truth is they want to be involved. And I don't think that it's that they want to dictate what's happening or what you're doing in the classroom. It's just that they want to be able to peer in and they want to be able to see it. And I know as a parent, part of that is wanting to know how well my student is doing. But I think another piece of it is just being deeply curious. And if I look at what's happening in preschool and I look at what my student brings home every day, she brings home a backpack with just little artifacts of her learning, just kind of like almost like a paper. Well, it is literally a paper trail, but it's almost like a breadcrumb trail too, giving me a sense of what's happening for her. And I start to see little changes. If we think about the difference between a preschooler bringing home drawings to then the kind of worksheets with grades on top that might get sent home with kids at older grades. And if you think about which of those is actually fulfilling my need, the truth is I can pretty much say immediately that what I'm getting from my preschool student is fulfilling my need much more than the worksheet with a grade on the top would. But the thing is that we've slowly habituated something's going to come home with the kids every day, and then it gets increasingly quantitative. And then if the parent is getting worksheets with grades on the top from other courses, or other grade levels, and then suddenly they're not getting it from you. I mean, to me, it's about what are you sending home, and whether that's literally something every day, but thinking about what am I sending home and what do I want to communicate to parents. And I also think that parents, if you have a conversation with parents and you say, I just am really increasingly distraught at how much learning is being turned into crude quantification, a stack of numbers, a stack of test scores, a stack of grades on a transcript. The vast majority of parents are going to say, yes, I get what you're saying. But then it's like, what do you do in the space of that? But I'm also curious, because you've all had these conversations with parents. I'm curious if what I'm saying actually resonates with other folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. And I would say the vast majority of parents that I deal with are very supportive of whatever, and they're not questioning, whatever we're doing. And I do try and communicate with them, but there's always, a few that are very marks oriented, and it can be a challenge for sure. Yeah. I'm thinking of one parent in particular, as we often do in these cases. So
yeah. I also wonder if there's a way to get parents together in a room talking with one another, because I mean, it's the same thing why I open up a conversation about grades with students, to get them hearing from each other and getting them learning from each other. I think finding ways to do that with parents as well, so that parents hear other parents and hear what they're encountering with their kids. They might not even notice the changes in what their kid is bringing home, and I mean both literally the paper or the mindset that the kids are bringing home. And hearing from another parent describing, gosh, after your class, my kids suddenly started interacting with their Legos in a completely different way. And if another parent hears that, they might go, wait, I didn't even notice that. And so I think having parents hear that from each other would be beneficial. Jennifer.
I really like what Ian just wrote, and I work with Amy, and we do send home regular updates to let the parents also know what we've been working on, what they can ask their students about. But I do think there's a conversation to be had about how we bring parents into the conversation. And we were talking about that with our admin this week, because some of our students in grade 7 and 8 gifted know what the admissions grades are for the university they are trying to go to. And they're obsessed with it. And these are 12-year-olds who know they want to go to MIT and they need to keep straight A pluses. And there's a pressure on us because I can't guarantee A pluses and then percentage and so forth. And the parents aren't even focused on the gaining knowledge and keeping an interest in learning. They're more focused on the grades and the admissions to the universities. And so it's like cutting out 5, 6, 7 years of enjoyable learning because they're already focused on the university they want to go to.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really hard to kind of get them to trust us and let their child just learn and explore and question, because that's their sights are so set on this one goal that it just, I don't know. Everything is like, is this a A plus? Is this a 4 plus? If it's not, can I redo it?
Yeah. Gosh, and so if you think about stakes, and in my work, I often talk about how high stakes lead to poor performance among students. Immediately, if you think about that and you think about how what the parent is doing is increasing the stakes for the student, which is actually going to lead to poorer performance. To some degree, there's a lot of data that shows that. So again, bring the data. And when that parent says to that, say, okay, so here's what the data shows. I want your kid to perform extraordinarily well. I want them to get in a good college if that's what they want to do with their life. Here's how we get them there. We don't get them there by raising the stakes. Here's the data. So like keeping it as simple as like that and just focused on, I have the same goals as you, but here's what my training shows me. The other thing that I would say, and this is a really hard thing to teeter around, is that asking yourself, who is the grade for, is a good question. Who is our syllabus for? Who is our curriculum for? Et cetera, et cetera. All of those. Who is the course description for? Who is our lesson plan for? Honestly, it's for a lot of people because generally we have to turn those things in. The parents often see them, so they have a huge audience. But I think we can all agree that the primary audience for all of those things is the student. And so keeping focused on not doing harm to the student's learning for the sake of this negotiation with the parent. And then it leads me to, what are the stakes for you? Can a parent do something that would make you lose your job? Truth is, they probably can. And enough parents certainly could. And so that means the stakes are pretty high for you. And so figuring out how to mitigate all of that. Like I believe my job is to advocate for students, and that means advocate to students in my relationship to the institution. If the institution is doing harm, I have to manage up where I can and where it's not detrimental for me to do so. And then the same thing with parents. I feel like if what the parent is doing harm, I can't be complicit with that. I have to find ways to negotiate that in a way that keeps me protected, but also in a way that is advocacy for the students. And ultimately, sometimes that means I'm going to be at odds with a parent. And I've been at odds with a parent before. And luckily, since I mostly teach high school students, I have a pretty good, way of just saying, look, they're adults. The law actually says that I share information with them, and it's actually illegal for me to share information with you without the student's permission. You're in a bit different situation where you actually, where the parents have, and I don't know the law in your context as well as I know it in my context, but I believe you still have a reporting obligation to parents, that parents have access to the data and that the student doesn't have to offer their permission in order for parents to see their grades or to see any of their learning materials. And so, yeah, it's a tricky negotiation. I wonder if other folks have thoughts they want to jump in on that or anything else. Go ahead.
And I just think when it comes back to the mental health piece, like we have students who, again, in the same program, who after reports are talking about self-harm, are talking about how their parents are going to be angry, are talking about how they have 4 hours of Spirit of Math homework every night. And it's not because they're curious. It's not because, they love the subject. It's because it's a culture around our school that everyone takes these because they're competing for, again, post-secondary spots. And it's really hard because sometimes it is student driven and sometimes it is parent driven, right? And I think the conversation needs to come out where we're educating parents about how this can do more harm, right, than encourage the learning.
Yeah. Did I share with you all, I can't remember if I did this, and I want to give a trigger warning for this because this is pretty upsetting data and a pretty upsetting article, but you'll be able to tell from the title, and I would just say if it's upsetting to you, don't click past the title. The title is When Report Cards Go Out on Fridays, Child Abuse Increases on Saturdays. Study finds. And so the thing you're describing is we're talking about existential angst, we're talking about bureaucratic trauma, we're talking about, but in some cases, we're also talking about physical abuse. And so the anxiety that students feel is not just hypothetical. It isn't just emotional. In some cases, it's also attached to physical repercussions. And so I think acknowledging that ends up being really important, acknowledging that with students, acknowledging that when we're in conversation with parents, that there is the potential to do real harm. And that what my job as a teacher is to try and mitigate that harm to the best of my ability. And I think being really frank about that is valuable. So, I mean, this is also the kind of thing that in the right environment, obviously I wouldn't share this article with a specific parent because that would be, that would create a problematic relationship with that parent. But if there's a ways, again, to share data like this, like here's how an emphasis on quantifying student learning can affect their performance. Here's how high stakes exams affect performance. Here's how things like video monitoring of students or surveillance of students affects their performance. And here's some of the real physical implications of this. I think that can be powerful with parents to help them understand that the stakes, so now we're talking about stakes again, that the stakes are really high for kids because it can impact their entire lives. And so helping parents understand that you're not making these decisions for willy-nilly, weird, touchy-feely pedagogical reasons, that you're trying to protect their kids and that you are trying to be a fierce advocate for kids and for their kids in particular. I think that can help them understand a little bit better. But I still think it goes back to the comment earlier. I still think there are going to be individual parents who you struggle with, who don't get that for whatever reason. Other thoughts or questions? So are there things something that I want to talk about is, because I know that you spent the first part of this session talking through some of your practice. And I would love to talk about some of the barriers that you're facing and some of the stuff that are keeping you from moving forward in this work. To some degree, we're already talking about that. But I'm wondering if we can cut through some of those barriers and talk through some of the specific stuff that you're encountering. One of the things that I have in my back pocket is for us to, because I often talk in sessions because people will say, well, I don't think I'm allowed to do X, Y, or Z because of the state requirements or my district's requirements. I have in my back pocket the actual requirements that many of you are subject to. So I feel like sometimes it's useful just to go look at those together and talk through some of them so you can see where your own practice can find its way. But I'd also love to just start with whatever people are encountering, whatever barriers you have, to move from these micro changes to more macro level changes. Because ultimately, the thing I always say about ungrading is that it can't just be about changing grades. It actually has to be about rethinking everything that you're doing in your classroom. But you don't do that all at once. There's lots of small steps towards getting there. Jennifer.
Thanks, Jesse. I moved gradeless this semester, and I'm teaching grade 12s and 11s. And I'm seeing great conversation, lots of benefits, excellent reflection, all of the great things that happen with being ungraded. The issue I'm having is in the practice of it. So I'm feeling like it's exhausting. And especially when we come to those times where I need to, or the student and I need to negotiate what we're putting on this report card as a number, I found that I just didn't have enough hours to sit down and have those conversations, but meaningful conversations on the fly have been happening. So I guess I'm looking for some logistical strategies to help sort of document that process and make it a little more streamlined or efficient for a classroom setting?
Yeah. Well, it depends. I mean, it really depends on how many students you have. So if I have 15 students and I only 15 students, you know, which I'm sure is not what any of you are dealing with, but if I only have 15 students, I could do 1-hour meetings with every student where we talk through and where we negotiate and discuss, and we could even bubble that, you know, bubble-in sheet together, which would be a really empowering thing for, and not just for students, but empowering for us too, because it would help us realize, oh, this isn't just I listen to the student and then, you know, go bubble something in, which always seems a little strange to me. But if you're dealing with 45 students, you can't do 1-hour sessions. If you're dealing with 100 students, you can't even effectively do 30-minute sessions. And how much with this kind of work can you actually accomplish in 10 minutes? You could do 10-minute conferences with every student, but I think that you barely scratch the surface. So what I tend to do is I relieve myself from feeling like I have to have individual conversations with every single student. I have large group conversations with all of the students where we read something about grades and just talk about it and get a sense for sort of the hum in the room. And then in the process that I use for self-reflection and self-evaluation, I make sure that I am collecting through that process all of the data that I need to make that final, you know, make that, whether it's a final decision or whether it's just the action of transferring the grade they gave themselves to the sheet. So students, share with me some representative examples of your work. So I have 2 hyperlinks right in front of me. And I say share 2 to 3 things so that I don't end up with 16 things that I'm reviewing. I don't do a portfolio because at that moment when you're trying to turn in grades, you don't have time to look at an entire portfolio. What I want is some representative examples. And I want what the students feel like is captures their work. Because then what I find out is I found out a couple of things. I find out both what they think their representative work is, and then I also get to look at the representative work. And I find it more valuable to see what they choose. And so I make it very open-ended. Just share with me 2 things, 2 examples. And it can be cut and paste or share a hyperlink or just point me to it if I've already got it on file. I sort of like to have everything in front of me. And then I make sure that at the very end, there's a space for them to ask me questions, but I don't require them to answer that question. I just say, and if you have more questions for me, and if there's stuff you want to talk about here, and then the final bit is I offer them the ability to set up an appointment with me. So then what I get is a self-selected group of students that I'm having individual conferences with. And in the framing of that, I sort of suggest who that might be ideal for and who it might not be. One thing I do is if a student is giving themselves a low grade, I say, in order to give yourself this low grade, you have to have a conference with me. And they do that. It can sometimes deter them from giving themselves the lowest grade, but I usually find, I mean, I'm not dealing with a lot of D's and F's in my courses. And if I am, it's students that just didn't show up. And so they're not filling out the self-reflection anyway. You know, and that's the key thing that they cannot, that's the key way they can get a D or F is just by not even engaging in the process of the class. The worst grades in my classes are the people who don't do those self-reflective activities. And so make sure you have everything that you need right there. And then the other key is give yourself permission to make mistakes. Give yourself permission to make mistakes. And the thing that I do is give yourself permission to err on the side of kindness. And ultimately, when you feel a conundrum, give the higher grade. And because it doesn't hurt people, you know, it doesn't hurt people to give them a higher grade, as long as you're also engaging with them about their learning, because ultimately ungrading is about decentering the grade or de-emphasizing the grade. And hopefully you've done that by that point. And the truth is, I could give you an A, Jennifer, and then say, but I want to have a talk with you about something I noticed. And the truth is, whether I gave you a low grade or a high grade doesn't change my ability to give you honest feedback. It's not like suddenly if you give a student a high grade, they won't listen to your honest feedback. I find that for the most part, the grade is almost irrelevant to that honesty. What really it is trust that's required at that moment. And so ultimately, that's the 2 things I'd say. Give yourself permission to make mistakes in favor of the student, and then also don't feel like you have to meet with every single student. I tried to do that early on, and I just found that so many of those conversations were just spinning our wheels. They weren't necessary is the thing, and they weren't productive. A self-selected group of conferences, all of a sudden you can do real fine tuning work. And when it's self-selected, you also have the ability to be a lot more honest. If a student self-selects into a conference with you, you know that they're coming able to listen or wanting to listen, even if it's still difficult, to your honest feedback. Does that help a little?
It does. Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to sit with that and think on that. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I also, and the thing is, if you feel like you want to, you or anyone feel like you want to meet with your students, every student individually, expect yourself only to do it once a year or once a term. Don't expect yourself to do it at every point. You know, it could be also where you have them self-select into a conference when they feel like they really need it the most. And then the student can kind of decide. There's some students who want to have a conference with you right out of the gate. And that's because that's how their process works. There's other students who will meet with you at the very end and then want to sit and reflect. And so in talking to them about how they might make those choices, and then all of a sudden you're maybe looking at 3 conference periods throughout a year, or throughout a semester, depending on how long you have the students. And then they're getting to self-select into the point when that individual feedback is going to be most useful for them. Other thoughts or questions? Sarah.
All right. Jim's actually going to speak.
Yeah, sorry, it's going to be me in the back here.
Okay. Hi, Jim.
Hi. I guess one of my challenges is that I'm noticing it feels like the way my courses have been designed are not necessarily necessary or effective when I start doing things gradeless. Like I've been doing it with my 3 Cs. So I guess my question is, are kind of culminating in larger assignments, or I call them learning tasks now, are those important at the end of units now? Or is there a better way to start to kind of assess students' learning and not worrying about these larger tasks?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on the class, but I think so often we emphasize finished products, we emphasize large accomplishments instead of all of the steps that go into making those happen. And what I notice is not just with college students, but also just with adults, that most of the adults I work with are so finished product oriented that they don't even necessarily know how to break down a larger task into individual subtasks. And so they really struggle with that. And so I mean, to some degree, I might still have students working towards a final product, but the final product becomes almost irrelevant, because what we're really doing is we're using that final product as a catalyst for all the other things that we do. And so different things that you might do is shift all of the grading and feedback to earlier points in the process. I don't actually, and this is not true of all of my colleagues who work similar to me, I don't give feedback on the final product at all, unless the student specifically asks for it. All of my feedback, and you know, it does a nice thing for me when all of my colleagues are talking about all of the work they're having to do, commenting on final projects and grading. I say, gosh, grading took me 45 minutes. And I don't say that like, you know, I don't say that to make them feel bad about the time they're putting in, but to essentially emphasize that I've tried to shift my workload so that it isn't compressed into a single space of time, because that creates too much anxiety for me. And so, I mean, partly a way to de-emphasize that final product is by shifting the conversations to being about the processes or the subtasks that might lead to a final product, and then also to shift all the feedback to those things, and to make sure that the grade is focused on students' reflection on the process as opposed to the end product itself. The other thing is, I think we all imagine when we go to design a course that every course needs a final product or a final project. I think letting ourselves realize, like, what is the specific goal of this course I'm teaching this term this year? Does a final product make sense as the capstone for that course? So I guess I would say that we are all kind of bound by habit that every course needs a final project or a final product or some kind of large capstone assignment. And I think that maybe 20% of courses actually benefit from that. Does that help?
Yeah, it does, because that's kind of what I've been toying around with. Is it feels that I need to almost restructure that whole course, because it's being designed that way that it leads towards this end product, because that's been the thing that's easy to mark and just move on to the next unit. So I kind of felt like you're saying that it doesn't feel necessary to me.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear like you don't give any feedback on that end of unit project, which I think makes sense to me, right? Because it should almost feel like, hey, this is just something you've accomplished. That's great. And it is the process. And when I've done, my midterm conferences with students, like I have let them use things that weren't related to those larger tasks to justify, where they have shown learning and growth in the course. So I think the main challenge for me is almost like I need to find the time, I guess, to just rethink the entire course again, which feels overwhelming in and of itself. And trying to find those things that are more intrinsically motivating for them, rather than me being used to it and them being used to it, that we learn these skills, we practice them, and then there's this bigger thing to show all of those skills together. So it just, it feels like kind of a lot to organize.
I think also just letting go of, like, again, don't feel like you have to get it all right all at once. Let yourself change parts of your approach and then watch the way that they impact other parts and bring students into a discussion of that. Like, wow, suddenly now the way that we're doing this, it doesn't feel like this final project is even necessary. So I'm just going to make it optional. Or I'm going to say, I'm not even going to collect it. And part of the reason that I don't have to give feedback on final projects is they actually don't even turn them into me. My students only turn them into each other. So their final projects, either if they're submitting them online, which they've had to do in recent years, they share them with one another inside of our discussion space. And they don't even share them with me. I might come upon them in that discussion space, but I've really set up that space as a space for them, not necessarily a space for a receptacle for their work for my purposes. Or they do some kind of expo at the end where they all share their work with each other. And they've gotten used to not necessarily getting formalized feedback from one another, but just appreciating and enjoying each other's work. I think when we get to that end project, that's the real goal of that in my brain, is just to sit with each other's work and just to see what each other did. It's almost like the work itself becomes another way of documenting what happened throughout a term. And I don't think we do that justice by, slapping a grade on it or by giving it all kinds of formalized feedback. And the other thing I guess I would say about big final projects is stakes. Going back to the question of stakes, high stakes lead to high stress, which leads to raises in cortisol levels, which leads to poorer performance. And so anything that we can do to decrease the stakes is to the good. And so that means high stakes testing. That means large final projects that determine a lot of their fate. It means, or even to some degree, large things that have to be perfect that are presented to a public audience, rather than finishing a course by saying, at the end of this, you're going to have a really cool thing that you've made, but it's going to be a prototype. It's going to be a work in progress. And even on that final day, we're not going to be looking at finished things, because you've got a whole life ahead of you to finish things. We're going to be looking at these prototypes and talking about what we've done. Other thoughts or questions? Greg.
I'm wondering if you can speak about how your model allowed you to have the students feel about that growth beyond your course. Because as you said, they're doing this growth beyond this course. It's going on to the rest of their life. Do you find that when they're moving on to other areas that they're still hearing about that expansion, or is that something that was my experience with Jesse, and now this is something else, in the next course that they're dealing with?
Yeah, I would say that I've only done my work well if they go on to their future courses feeling like they have some sort of sense of the matrix code behind their education. Like, that's the goal. It doesn't work all the time. But yeah, I absolutely hear from students that they started looking at all of their courses slightly differently. And it isn't that they suddenly tried to turn all of their courses into my course, but they kind of started to realize, oh, I actually perform better when I find ways to do work for myself. Oh, when I'm going to pick jobs, if I pick a job that actually is meaningful to me, I do better at the job. And so ideally they start to make sort of make changes in their life that then affects all the work they do in all of their courses positively. I mean, my hope is not to create, like, to short circuit their brain so that if they go to another class where they're graded traditionally, they can't do it, or they reject it, or they rebel against it. Maybe a little bit of rebelling against it is good, or resisting it, but also so that they go into that and realize and see that, oh, grades are just like everything else in our society. There's something that I need to critically read and evaluate and figure out my relationship with them, and that relationship is complicated. So, I mean, I think there are some cases where they might go to another class and find harm being done to them, and they might put their foot down and resist that harm. And I think that's a good thing. But more often it's not that. More often it's they go to their other classes and they find ways to better fit into all of the structures that they end up having to work in, because they see and understand those structures better. Some folks will always say, well, they're going to be graded like this in their other classes, so I have to prepare them for that by being hard and serious and rigorous. And I say, you know, you ultimately, if you look at trauma study, or if you look at studies around stress and anxiety, you don't prepare someone for a situation that would cause them trauma or anxiety by traumatizing them or having them experience anxiety. You prepare them for those situations by giving them space to talk about and reflect on how they deal with circumstances like that. So actually practicing within low stress environments or low stakes environments helps better prepare them for high stakes environments than practicing within high stakes environments, if that makes sense. And so ideally, the low stakes stuff that I do helps them perform better on high stakes stuff they might have to do in other courses.
Thank you very much.
So I have a little document here, which I'm curious just to use as a discussion point. And I think I am going to, can I share my screen? Will it allow me to share my screen, Matt?
Yeah, you should be good, Jesse.
I should be able to. Yeah.
There it is. And I'm going to make it larger, although only gave me the option to share my entire screen. I think you're seeing both yourselves and the document. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. We'll just work with that so that I don't fuss with technology. I'm going to go ahead and put the link. I'm going to go ahead and put the link in the chat so if folks want to look at this. I found this really curious when this was shared with me, because it's always interesting to look at how our institutions, how our governments, how our school districts talk about the work of grading. And one of the things that I noticed when I looked at this is that there's not a lot of literal barriers here to the kind of work you're all talking about, but there are a lot of just assumptions made in the way that grades are talked about. So this is a document talking about determining report card grades, but it's also connected to the Halton District School Board's administrative procedures. I note that these are for grades 7 through 12, but I actually went and looked at the government document itself from which these are drawn. And this is a government document talking about grades 1 to 12. So even if this says 7 to 12, these pieces here are meant to apply to all grades 1 through 12. And then they're duplicated across so many of these documents. But if we look at these, I think it's just kind of fascinating to see how grades are talked about. So ultimately, the goal of this is to, and let me just go ahead and share all of these documents. There's this one, and here is the government document from which these are drawn. But these little bullets appear in all of these documents. These administrative procedures are predicated on 7 fundamental principles central to all assessment, evaluation, and reporting, which insist that teachers use practices and procedures that, : It's interesting the word insist is in there. This is a very, this document itself is using a very emphatic thing, which my sort of worry when I see that is I feel like that essentially it scares teachers into compliance or conformity, even though there aren't hyper specific things here to which a teacher would conform or comply. So grades and the procedures around them need to be fair, transparent, and equitable. They need to support all students. They have to be carefully planned. They're communicated clearly to students and parents. They're ongoing, varied in nature, and administered over a period of time. I really think that word varied in nature gives a lot of space for experimentation and kind of growth and sort of the idiosyncratic nature of individual teachers. None of these documents are suggesting to me that all teachers would teach the same way. That they develop students' self-assessment skills to enable them to assess their own learning, set specific goals, and plan next steps for their learning. I also notice when I look at this one in determining report card grades, how is your grade determined? And again, this one links to that document we were just looking at. Uses both mathematical calculations and their professional judgment to determine your percentage mark, determining exactly how well you've demonstrated the learning expectations for a course is complex. I really like that bit. That also gives space. I'm curious if other folks looking at any of these documents, what you see in these, what resonates with you, what you find problematic. Do you notice things that put you in a conundrum? Have you looked at these documents and worried about how your own assessment approaches are impacted by these? I'm actually going to go ahead and stop presenting so that we all get into our happy boxes again, since I've shared those links. Lindsay, go ahead and jump in.
I haven't really read a lot of this too detailed before, but I saw in the HDSB one that you shared that it said don't use peer and self-evaluations when determining your final mark. They're a great way to reflect on your learning, but your teacher determines your grades. So I think that's interesting because that's kind of a little bit counter to what we're kind of talking about here.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, that it also is, that one is clearly the audience as students. And in some ways, I can see that the motivation of that is to protect teachers so that teachers feel like they have the authority to make decisions about how those things are used. I don't think that that necessarily restricts you from doing that in your individual classroom, but it's telling students don't, if you are asked to do self-reflective activities, don't assume that that will necessarily be the sole determiner in what your grade is. Because when I look here, since the very final bullet in the government document, as well as the thing that's reproduced by the Halton District School Board, is develop student self-assessment skills. I feel like, if anything, that's a reminder that individual teachers will approach this in different ways. They'll use self-reflection in different ways. And I think it is a bit contradictory, but I don't think it precludes your ability to do that. I certainly wouldn't read it that way. Other thoughts or other things that people are noticing, or even just going back to this question of sort of restrictions or places where you feel like your work is encountering barriers. Ian. And just so you know, I did find the Facebook group as well as a blog and podcast speaking directly to ungrading practices in K through 12. And there's actually an interview with me at one point in one of the podcast episodes. And I shared that up a bit above. Ian.
Yeah, for me, one of the barriers is I'm struggling here. If we never give kids marks until the report card, that report card could be a pretty traumatic event if they thought, oh, I'm doing great, when in fact they're not doing great. So something I started last year or a couple of years ago was about a month before the report card comes out in early January, I would tell them, if I had to do a report card today, this is where I see you. Let's talk about that. Do you agree with that? Are you okay with that? And then I gave them a lot of space to kind of specifically work on the things that they wanted to refine before that number got on a sheet of paper that went home. Yeah. Is that in keeping with the kind of culture of an ungraded classroom, or am I kind of bridging two worlds there?
Well, I mean, I think probably you are bridging two worlds, but we are necessarily bridging two worlds because, as you point out, a grade is being put on that final transcript. And what you don't want students to be is be surprised by that grade. And even more than that, you don't want them to worry that they'll be surprised by that grade, because the worry that they might be surprised by that grade is the thing that will have the most negative effect on their learning and their performance. So doing an activity like you're doing is helping them break, because they're probably feeling the anxiety. They just necessarily will. They'll feel a certain amount of anxiety about, is this real? Is a rug going to get pulled out from under me? Is this all a ruse? This isn't real. This can't possibly be real. If they're feeling that, it's not helping. And so finding ways, whatever they are, to help sort of break the cycle of those emotions, I think is useful. A certain amount of anxiety, and going back to the study about, the studies about hormone levels and cortisol levels, a certain amount of anxiety is actually really great for learning. So I don't think we have to be afraid to make students feel uncomfortable. And so if ungrading is making them feel a little bit anxious or a little bit uncomfortable, that actually has been shown, low spikes in cortisol levels have been shown to be productive, useful for learning, useful for critical evaluation, useful for self-reflection. So it's not that you're trying to alleviate every bit of anxiety, but you want to make sure that students aren't having extreme amounts of anxiety about it that are then negatively affecting their learning, their performance, as well as their relationship with you and their relationships with their fellow students. I find that means, it goes back again, not every student needs the reassurance. Some students, in fact, the reassurance will center the grades even more and actually increase the anxiety. So I think it's more about figuring out which students need some reassurance or need that discussion. For the exercise you're talking about, I would have students opt into that rather than just do it across the board for all your students. It would save you time, and it would also only center the grades for those students that are feeling that acute anxiety. And I would say it's something like this. If you're feeling a little bit of anxiety, that's normal. But if you feel confident, it's okay to feel a little bit of anxiety. If you're feeling so much anxiety that it's affecting your performance and your learning, let's have a conference and let's talk through the grade that you would give yourself. I also like the idea in that conference of actually pulling up, if you can pull up the screen that you're going to be looking at when because I assume it's a screen with a little drop-down menu with an A, actually showing them what it's going to look like on your end and letting them inside if there's a way to do that, obviously securing all of the other students' information. If there's a way to do that, so that they feel like, oh, this is what's going to happen at the end. He's going to go in and do this. So instead, it's not some mysterious process that's going to happen outside their view. That might be a useful thing also to alleviate their anxiety. But again, you probably have to feel the student out. That might be a traumatizing event in and of itself. Other thoughts? So we're officially over on time for this part of the discussion. And I know that they've got other amazing things to take you on to, but I'm happy if there's any final words or final questions. And I say final, but I hope it's not final. I really secretly want to come, well, not secretly, because I've already told you all this, I think, before. I want to come visit you all in person. I guess I just want to end by saying thank you. It's been so great to work with you over all of these sessions. From the start of the planning for this, I expressed how much I like working with folks multiple times, not just dropping in and giving a keynote, but actually getting to talk to you and recognize some of your faces and see you appear again has been a delight for me, and also helps me kind of get inside of what's going on for all of you, which is useful in my own practice as well.